Now we move into cutting edge testing. The first one of these is a test I'm really quite excited about called Volumetrics. Volumetrics uses MRI again as a platform for yet another new test. Uses MRI along with special software. Most commonly the software I'm referring to is called NeuroQuant, but MRI along with NeuroQuant software or other software is now able to enable us to measure different regions of the brain in order to determine whether there has been atrophy in that discrete region. Now, Volumetrics breaks it up into 44 different regions, 45 if we consider the whole brain as one of those measurements. And no longer are we using the naked eye to make these measurements. We now have a concise computer-generated measurement with the use of volumetrics. Concept is simple. We're comparing your client's brain with those who do not suffer from traumatic brain injury of the same sex, age, and intracranial volume in order to determine whether there's atrophy. Age is the most important factor because we all lose volume as we age. Various brain structures lose volume. For example, the hippocampus, which I talked about just earlier, the hippocampus loses about 1% of its volume every year. Some of the young lawyers in my office sometimes tease me that at my age I should have no hippocampus left at all, but I'm still here and I'm still doing it, so I ignore those. Seriously though, it is an important factor, and you have to understand that, again, the brain is constantly changing, and damage to the brain can be tracked as it changes as well. Let me show you a little bit about what volumetrics looks like. Here we have imagery of a normal brain. Here to the right we see two normals to the right hand side and two images taken from someone who has suffered a traumatic brain injury. And if you look in the center of the top right hand image, you see this area here looks kind of like a butterfly, right? That's actually space. Those are the ventricles. That's where there is no brain material. It's space. It's a gap between brain matter. And if you look to the left at someone similarly situated by age and intracranial volume and gender, you see that this ventricle is larger, the space is larger because the brain is actually smaller in that area. And you look up top where these arrows are and you can also compare to the normal or the control and see that it is larger. It is an abnormally large space. And down at the bottom we see the computer-generated imagery quite clearly. Here's ventricle on the right-hand side of normal size, but look how much larger the ventricles are in that image. This second image compares two 14-year-olds, a healthy 14-year-old again over on the right-hand side, and the other 14-year-old with a significant brain injury on the left. You can see on the top again the ventricles much larger on the TBI victim, but look at the bottom. See on the right-hand side how the brain has a nice healthy look to it, but look to the left. Look at what we call the sulci, or the folds of the brain. See how much more defined they are. They're darkening. They're actually shrinking. It's actually imploding and shrinking as volume is decreasing, and we can see more defined the sulci of the brain. A very bad sign. In fact, this is such a global effect, perhaps the damage in this case could have been anoxic, lack of oxygen to the brain, as opposed to one discrete area being damaged by a strike. Volumetrics is really more precise than PET or DTI for what it does. It's also important to note, however, that just like we have to be patient in other circumstances, we have to be patient with volumetrics. It takes approximately 6 months to a year and a half for the full effect of atrophy to become recognized by this testing. So again, it's a process and not an event. It's a process and not an event. So you have to measure these, make these measurements over time. I love the test. I think it's going to become more common. There are less steps in the process, so there's less room for error. There's less expertise necessary than those who conduct, for example, DTI. It's easier to get the controls than it is for DTI and other testing. They're basic measurements. And the test results are rather automatic. 10 or 15 minutes after your client has had the volumetrics done, there's a result already. Now I want you to look at a different image involving volumetrics, and I call this apples to apples. Here we are, instead of comparing a normal brain to that of someone with traumatic brain injury, we're now comparing two images of the same person suffering from traumatic brain injury. This is taken a year after the injury. Take a look at these ventricles, these spaces. They're rather small as compared to 9 months later. The space is that much larger on the same brain. And that's because TBI is a process, not an event. Now that gives us all sorts of benefits that we can use in our cases. It can even help us give us more or less a general time that the injury occurred. You know, your case will frequently have in it the defense that, the accident didn't cause the injury, or maybe there's a question of pre-existing injury in your case. This can be a very useful tool to combat those claims. You can imagine that if somebody has a test a few months after an injury and continuous testing shows atrophy up till about a year and a half later and then stops, well, we can pretty much pinpoint the time of the injury as at least generally around the time of the accident. It's very important to get the testing done early. If it's not possible to get volumetrics done early, at least get an MRI done early. The right kind of MRI, as I'll tell you in a moment. And here's why. Because the very nice thing about volumetrics is we can do them with an old MRI. We can do volumetrics on the right kind of MRI that was taken 5 years ago. That's something that people don't take into account oftentimes and might miss, but you won't miss it. The key, however, is to have an MRI taken early, and what you want, and you might even be able to be in a position to request, is you want a T1 MP RAGE scan. That's the type of MRI you want, a T1 MP RAGE scan. And then it's important to repeat the test, and I really do think that volumetrics with these sorts of benchmarks are a thing we're going to see a great deal of in the future. It's going to help plaintiffs who are deserving and who and help them to really be able to express their case properly. Again, the downside is it takes some time, so you have to be patient. You have to have the time in your case to be able to do this testing.